Why was the body lying exactly where it fell, 847 yards from her cabin door? Sheriff Tom Morrison stood over it that October morning, his breath turning to white clouds in the Montana cold. He studied the wound. Center mass. Through the heart. Clean entry, cleaner exit. The kind of shot that didn't just speak of training, it whispered of patience, of absolute certainty, of someone who'd done this before, many times before. His radio crackled. "Sheriff, we got another one quarter-mile west. Same MO, single shot, long range." Morrison lowered his scope and looked up toward the cabin, up toward the woman standing there like she'd been carved from the mountain itself. 27 years old, barely 5'3", blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She looked like she should be teaching kindergarten, not dropping men at distances most people couldn't even see. He started the long walk up to her cabin, each step heavier than the last. "Self-defense." The words cut through the cold before he reached the steps. Her voice carried that flat certainty, not an argument, just a fact. "They had rifles, they were on my property, they were warned." Morrison stopped at the bottom of the stairs. 18 years as sheriff of Copper Ridge. He knew when someone was lying. He also knew when someone was telling a truth that would complicate his entire week. "Miss Blackwood," he said carefully, "I'm going to need you to walk me through the last 96 hours." Eleanor nodded once. "You're going to want coffee for this, Sheriff. It's a long story." She turned and walked inside. Morrison followed, knowing that whatever came next would change everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman who'd bought the old Patterson property 8 months ago. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that it would resurrect secrets buried for 50 years, challenge everything his town believed about heroes and legends, and prove that the deadliest sniper in Montana wasn't the grizzled Marine colonel they all worshipped. It was the girl they'd all dismissed 96 hours earlier. But to understand the bodies, to understand the shots, to understand why Eleanor Blackwood stood on that porch with zero regret in her eyes, you had to go back to the moment she realized she'd never be enough for this town, back to the night that broke something inside her, back to the meeting. The town meeting at Copper Ridge Community Hall was supposed to be simple: water rights, boundary disputes, standard Montana business, ranchers arguing over creek access, property owners debating fence lines, the usual territorial chess game that rural communities played every autumn. Eleanor sat in the back row, trying to be invisible. She'd only come because her property was mentioned in the agenda, some question about an old access road that crossed her northern boundary. She planned to listen, nod when appropriate, and leave without conversation. That plan died the moment Colonel Jameson Thorne stood to speak. At 67, Thorne looked like he'd been carved from the same mountain surrounding the valley. 6'2", silver hair cut high and tight, shoulders that hadn't forgotten the weight of a ruck. His face was weathered leather creased by decades of wind and sun, and his eyes held that kind of clarity that made people uncomfortable. He saw too much, remembered everything. Copper Ridge treated him like royalty. Thorne was their claim to fame, their connection to something larger than cattle and hay prices. Marine Force Recon, 25 years of service. Grenada, Panama, Desert Storm, Somalia. 89 confirmed kills across a career that had become legend. He'd retired here in 2001, bought a ranch on the eastern edge of town, and spent his days training horses and his evenings holding court at Murphy's Bar, telling sanitized versions of stories that would make most civilians lose sleep. The room quieted when he stood. Even the most argumentative rancher knew to shut up when Iron Thorne had something to say. "Before we move forward," Thorne said, his voice carrying that parade ground authority of a man who'd commanded in combat, "I want to address something that's been bothering me." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She didn't know why. Some instinct. The same one that had kept her alive in Helmand Province. "We've got new people moving into our valley," Thorne continued. Good people mostly, hard workers, folks who respect the land and the community. He paused, scanning the room. His eyes found her, locked on. But we also need to be clear about who we are and what we value here. Alina's hands gripped the edge of her chair. I heard we got a former Navy SEAL who bought the old Patterson place. That right, Miss Blackwood? Every head turned, 50 pairs of eyes finding her in the back row. Alina stood slowly. Protocol. You stood when addressed by senior military, even in civilian settings. Some habits didn't break. Yes, sir. Appreciate your service, Thorne said. The words were correct. The tone was not. How long were you in? 6 years, sir. 2016 to 2022. Afghanistan, Syria. Both, sir. Thorne nodded slowly. I'm sure you did your best. Times have changed since I wore the uniform. Standards have changed. He let that hang in the air for a moment. SEAL training used to be the hardest thing in the world. Used to be that only the toughest, most capable warriors made it through. Men who could carry a wounded teammate 10 miles through enemy territory. Men who could operate for weeks without support, living on nothing but grit and determination. Alina felt her face flush. She knew where this was going. Now they're letting anyone through, Thorne said. Lowering standards, political correctness. They're graduating people who can't carry a full combat load. Hell, they're graduating 100-pound girls who couldn't drag a wounded man to safety if their lives depended on it. The room was silent. Someone coughed, a chair creaked. I'm not saying women can't serve, Thorne continued, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a man who knew he was saying something controversial but believed it anyway. There are plenty of support roles where they excel. Medical, communications, intelligence, but combat, direct action, that's a different animal. That requires a kind of strength and endurance that, frankly, most women just don't have. Alina's jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. Say something, her mind screamed. Defend yourself. Tell him about the 47 combat missions, the teammates you brought home alive, the confirmed kills at ranges he couldn't imagine. But she didn't. Because she'd learned in 6 years of fighting for respect in a male-dominated community that arguing only made it worse. You didn't win by talking. You won by doing. And she hadn't done anything yet that these people could see. So yes, Miss Blackwood, I appreciate your service. Thorne's smile was grandfatherly, condescending, final. I'm sure you did your best with what nature gave you, but let's not pretend that SEAL standards are what they used to be. This valley respects real warriors, the kind forged in real combat under real standards. He sat down to murmurs of agreement. A few uncomfortable looks shot Alina's way, mostly sympathy, the kind you give someone who's been publicly corrected by their betters. Alina remained standing for 3 heartbeats longer than necessary, long enough for Thorne to notice, long enough to make it clear she'd heard him, long enough to remember. Then she sat down, her face burning, and endured another 90 minutes of meaningless discussion about nothing that mattered. When the meeting finally ended, she was the first one out the door. She drove home in silence, the kind of silence that screamed inside your skull, the kind that made you grip the steering wheel until your knuckles turned white, the kind that reminded you why you'd left the service in the first place. Because no matter how good you were, no matter how many missions you completed, no matter how many teammates you brought home alive, there would always be someone ready to tell you that you didn't belong, that you weren't good enough, that your accomplishments were somehow lesser because of what you were born as. The purchase of 8,400 acres of Montana wilderness had seemed like salvation. After 6 years of proving herself in the most demanding military community in the world, after 47 missions where she'd performed flawlessly, after carrying wounded teammates and making shots that put her in the top 5% of SEAL snipers, Alina had finally had enough. The ambush outside Lashkar Gah had been the breaking point. 3 teammates killed, 2 more wounded so badly they'd never serve again. Alina had been the only one who made it out of that valley without bleeding. She'd killed 7 Taliban fighters that day, providing cover fire for the evacuation that saved the wounded. She'd done her job perfectly. And she decided she never wanted to do it again. The nightmares came every night for 8 months. The what-ifs, the if-onlys, the faces of men she couldn't save. The therapist at Walter Reed explained it was survivor's guilt, told her it was normal, told her it would fade. It didn't fade, it just changed shape. So Alina took her discharge, took her savings, and bought the most isolated property she could find. A mountain, her mountain, 8,400 acres of pine forest, rocky peaks, and absolute solitude. No neighbors for miles, no one to judge, no one to tell her she wasn't enough. Just peace, just silence, just her and the mountain. She'd been there 8 months when Colonel Thorne reminded her that peace was a lie, that silence was temporary, that no matter how far you ran, judgment would find you. That night, Alina sat on her porch with a bottle of whiskey she had no intention of drinking. She just held it, stared at it, thought about all the ways people tried to drown the voices in their heads. But she'd never been a drinker, never been someone who ran from pain. She'd been trained to sit with it, to acknowledge it, to let it sharpen her instead of breaking her. So she sat there in the cold October darkness and let the anger come. Let the humiliation wash over her. Let herself feel every ounce of the dismissal, the condescension, the casual erasure of everything she'd accomplished. And then she set the bottle down and went inside to clean her rifles. Because that's what warriors did. They felt their feelings, and then they prepared for the next fight. What Alina didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the next fight was already coming, already moving through the darkness toward her mountain, already making decisions that would force her to become exactly what Colonel Thorne said she wasn't: the deadliest operator in the valley. 3 days after the town meeting, Alina found the first sign. She was running her morning patrol, a habit from deployment she'd never broken, when she noticed fresh tire tracks on the old logging road that cut through her northern boundary. ATV tracks, recent, within the last 24 hours. She knelt down studying them. Deep treads, heavy load, 2 vehicles, maybe 3. Her property had no trespassing signs every 100 yards. The fence line was clearly marked. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Alina pulled out her phone, took photos of the tracks, and continued her patrol. A mile further she found where they'd stopped. Boot prints in the soft earth, cigarette butts, energy bar wrappers. They'd been here for a while, watching something, planning something. Her instincts, those combat instincts that had kept her alive through 47 missions, started screaming. She followed the boot prints. They led up a ridge through thick pine cover to a clearing that overlooked the western section of her property, the section she rarely visited, the section that was all granite outcrops and steep ravines, useless for anything except solitude. Except now there were people interested in it. Alina spent the next hour following sign, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken branches. 4 men, maybe 5. Experienced outdoorsmen. They knew how to move quietly, how to cover their tracks, but Alina had been trained by the best trackers in the SEAL teams. She could read terrain like most people read books. What she found made her blood run cold. Survey stakes, freshly driven into the ground, marking boundaries, marking dig sites, and strangest of all, radiation detectors, the cheap kind you could buy online, scattered around like someone had been testing the ground. Alina photographed everything. Then she hiked back to her cabin and started researching. Property records, historical surveys, mining claims, old government documents. She spent 12 hours digging through archives, following threads, connecting dots. What she found was impossible and terrifying. Her property, her mountain, sat directly on top of Site Yankee 7, a Cold War-era storage facility, built in 1964, decommissioned in 1973, officially empty, officially sealed, officially forgotten. Except the documents Alina found, buried in declassified archives, told a different story. Site Yankee 7 had stored tactical nuclear materials, small-scale warheads, enriched uranium, the kind of materials that, in the wrong hands, could level a city or poison a water supply for generations. The kind of materials that shouldn't exist anymore. That should have been recovered decades ago. That should have been properly disposed of. But Alina found a memo, dated 1974, stamped classified, detailing how budget cuts had forced the closure of Site Yankee 7 before full recovery operations could be completed, how the entrance had been sealed with concrete and steel, how the remaining materials that the memo didn't specify but heavily implied, had been left in place with plans to recover them at a later date. That later date never came. For 50 years, Site Yankee 7 had been buried under her mountain, forgotten by everyone except apparently the people who'd been on her property, the people surveying, the people testing for radiation, the people who clearly knew exactly what was down there. Alina sat back in her chair and felt her heart hammering. Someone was planning to dig it up, to recover whatever was left down there, to steal nuclear materials from a forgotten Cold War bunker. And they were doing it on her land. She had two choices: call the authorities, report what she'd found, let the FBI and the Department of Energy and whoever else handle it, or handle it herself. The old Alina, the Alina who'd sat in that town meeting and absorbed Colonel Thorne's condescension in silence, would have called the authorities, would have done everything by the book, would have trusted the system. But something had changed in the 3 days since that meeting. Some final thread of caring what people thought had snapped. Some final need for approval had died. Alina stood up, walked to her gun safe, and started pulling out equipment. If they wanted what was on her mountain, they'd have to go through her. And going through Alina Blackwood wasn't something anyone did twice. She spent the next 24 hours preparing, setting up observation posts, camouflaging positions, calculating ranges, planning fields of fire. Everything she'd learned in 6 years as a SEAL sniper, she poured into preparing her mountain. Because whatever was coming, she'd be ready. What she didn't know was that they were already here. The first shot she fired wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to warn. Alina had been in her primary observation post for 6 hours when she spotted them. 5 men, military age, moving with tactical precision through the northern section of her property. They carried rifles, excavation equipment, radiation suits. They weren't hunters, they weren't lost hikers, they were professionals, and they were here for Site Yankee 7. Alina tracked them through her scope, watched them set up camp, watched them start unpacking drilling equipment, watched them prepare to breach the sealed entrance that her research had told her was 300 yards south of where they were digging. They were using old maps, outdated surveys. They were close but not exact, which meant they'd be on her property for days, maybe weeks, digging, searching, getting closer to materials that could kill thousands if handled wrong, or kill millions if handled right by the wrong people. Alina keyed her radio. She'd set up speakers throughout the northern section, hidden in trees, camouflaged. "This is private property," her voice echoed through the forest. "You are trespassing. You have 30 minutes to pack your equipment and leave. This is your only warning." The men froze, looked around. Then one of them, the leader, Alina guessed from his body language, laughed. "Lady, we have a legal claim to this mineral deposit. We're not going anywhere." Alina's jaw clenched. Legal claim. They'd forged documents, created fake mining rights, built a paper trail that would take months to untangle legally. "You have 29 minutes, she said. The leader unslung his rifle, We have weapons, we have rights, and we're not leaving. 28 minutes later, a leaner put a round through their generator. The diesel engine exploded in a shower of sparks and smoke. The men scattered, taking cover, scanning the tree line, looking for the shooter they couldn't see. 27 minutes, a leaner's voice echoed. "Where the hell is she?" one of them shouted. "I don't know, but she's good," another replied. "That was an 800-yard shot." A leaner smiled. It had been 847 yards, but who was counting? She waited, watched them argue, watched them try to decide if she was bluffing, watched the leader make the worst decision of his life. "Pack the critical equipment," he ordered. "We'll come back tonight with more people, more guns. We'll deal with this bitch then." They started loading their trucks, but they didn't leave. They set up a defensive perimeter, started scanning the hills with binoculars, started planning. Alina had given them a choice. They'd made it. She adjusted her scope, calculated windage, controlled her breathing, and waited for them to cross the line from trespass to threat. It took 6 hours. As darkness fell, 2 of the men grabbed their rifles and started moving toward her cabin. Not leaving, not retreating, advancing, with weapons, with clear hostile intent. Alina watched them through her night vision scope, watched them approach her home, watched them prepare to breach, to threaten, to do whatever they'd come here to do. She thought about calling Sheriff Morrison, about letting the law handle it, about doing everything the right way. Then she thought about Colonel Thorne, about his speech, about his certainty that she wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't a real warrior. She thought about every time she'd been dismissed, underestimated, told she didn't belong. And she made her decision. The first man dropped at 847 yards, center mass, clean shot. He was dead before he hit the ground. The second man dove for cover, started screaming into his radio. "Shots fired, man down, we need." Alina's second shot cut him off, 823 yards, through the heart. Silence fell over her mountain. In her observation post, Alina chambered another round and waited. 3 men left, all of them now scrambling for their trucks, all of them realizing they'd made a terrible miscalculation. They thought she was some weekend warrior, some paper seal who'd gotten through on lowered standards, some girl playing soldier. They were wrong. Alina tracked the third man through her scope as he sprinted for the lead truck. He was fast, well-trained. He zigzagged, using cover, making himself a difficult target. She led him by 2 feet, adjusted for wind, and squeezed the trigger. 981 yards, moving target, headshot. The fourth man made it to his truck, started the engine. Alina could have let him go, could have let him run, could have ended it there. But he grabbed his radio, started calling for backup, started giving coordinates. More would come, more weapons, more people willing to steal nuclear materials, more threats to her home. Alina couldn't allow that. She put a round through his windshield, through his chest, through any hope he had of making that call. The fifth man, the leader, didn't run. He took cover behind a boulder and started returning fire. Blind shots, desperate shots. He had no idea where Alina was, but he was trying. She had to respect that. At least he was fighting. But respect didn't mean mercy. Alina adjusted her position, moved to a backup site she'd prepared, got a different angle, and when the leader leaned out to fire again, she ended it. One shot, 1,107 yards, the longest shot she'd ever made outside of combat. And just like in combat, it counted. Silence returned to the mountain, the kind of silence that comes after violence, the kind that rings in your ears, the kind that changes you. Alina sat in her observation post and felt nothing. No guilt, no regret, no second thoughts. They'd come to her home, they'd threatened her, they'd refused to leave, they'd advanced with weapons. Under Montana law, under any reasonable interpretation of self-defense. She'd done exactly what she was allowed to do. But more than that, more than legality, more than justification. She'd done what she'd been trained to do. Protect, defend, eliminate threats. She was a warrior, whether Colonel Thorne believed it or not, whether Copper Ridge respected it or not, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. She was exactly what the SEAL teams had made her. And tonight, 5 men had learned that lesson the hardest way possible. Alina packed up her equipment, secured her position, and walked back to her cabin through the darkness. Tomorrow Sheriff Morrison would come. Tomorrow there would be questions, investigations, complications. But tonight her mountain was safe. And Alina Blackwood slept without nightmares for the first time in 2 years. When Sheriff Morrison arrived the next morning and found the bodies, he knew immediately what he was dealing with. Precision shots, long range, calculated, professional. This wasn't panic, this wasn't luck. This was someone who'd done this before, someone who'd been trained to do this, someone who'd made these shots when lives depended on them. He looked up at Alina's cabin, at the woman standing there with no fear in her eyes, no guilt, just that flat certainty. And Morrison understood something that would take the rest of Copper Ridge much longer to learn. The deadliest sniper in Montana had just defended her mountain. And God help anyone who tried to cross her fence line again. But Alina's story was far from over, because what she'd found, what she'd protected, was bigger than 5 dead men, bigger than property rights, bigger than anything Copper Ridge had ever dealt with. Site Yankee 7 was real, the materials were still there, and someone had sent those men to retrieve them. Which meant more would come. Unless Alina stopped them first. Sheriff Morrison sat across from Alina in her cabin drinking coffee that was too strong and trying to process what she'd just told him. Declassified documents spread across her kitchen table, radiation readings, survey maps, 50 years of buried secrets. Nuclear materials, he said slowly, under your mountain. Tactical warheads, enriched uranium, maybe more. Alina's voice was steady, clinical, the voice of someone briefing a mission. Site Yankee 7, built 1964, decommissioned 1973, never fully cleared out. Morrison rubbed his face, and these men were here to steal it. They had forged mining claims, fake permits. They'd built a paper trail that would have kept you tangled in court for months while they dug it up and disappeared. So you killed them. I defended my property from armed intruders who refused to leave and advanced on my home with weapons. Alina met his eyes. Montana law is clear on this, Sheriff. I had every right. Morrison couldn't argue. She was technically correct, but technically correct and morally comfortable were 2 different things. 5 men, he said quietly. 5 shots, 5 kills. Alina, that's not normal self-defense, that's military precision. Alina finished his sentence. I know what it looks like, I know what people will say, that I overreacted, that I should have called you, that a real person would have been scared, would have missed, would have. She stopped, took a breath. But I'm not a normal person, Sheriff. I'm a Navy SEAL sniper with 6 years of combat experience. When armed men threaten my home, I don't panic, I execute. That's what I was trained to do. The word execute hung in the air. Morrison heard it for what it was, not just elimination of threats, but judgment, sentence, finality. The FBI is going to get involved, he said. Department of Energy, probably Homeland Security. This is going to get complicated. I know. They're going to question everything. Your service record, your mental state, whether this was really self-defense or what? Alina's voice sharpened. Whether I'm some damaged veteran who snapped, some unstable woman who couldn't handle civilian life, whether the trauma finally caught up and I just started killing people. Morrison held up his hands. I didn't say that. But you thought it. Alina's jaw clenched. Everyone will think it. The FBI psychologist will ask about my nightmares, about survivor's guilt, about PTSD. They'll try to build a narrative where I'm the broken one, where this was murder, not defense. Was it, Morrison asked quietly, defense? Alina stared at him. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she stood, walked to her gun safe, and pulled out a folder. She dropped it on the table in front of Morrison. "Read it." Morrison opened the folder. Inside were intercepts, communications, intelligence reports, names and photos of known arms dealers, terrorists, and black market operators, all of them connected to nuclear materials theft, all of them active in the western United States. "Where did you get this?" Morrison breathed. "I still have friends in the intelligence community. When I found the survey stakes, I reached out, asked questions, called in favors." Alina leaned against the counter. "Those 5 men weren't random criminals, Sheriff. They were professionals, connected to a network that specializes in recovering Cold War-era materials and selling them to the highest bidder. Syria, Iran, North Korea, anyone with enough money and enough hatred." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "You're saying—" "I'm saying that if they'd succeeded, if they'd gotten even a fraction of what's down there, thousands of people could die, maybe more. A dirty bomb in New York, poisoned water in Lowe's Angels, take your pick." Alina's voice was hard, flat. "Those 5 men weren't just trespassing. They weren't just thieves. They were facilitating mass murder. And you knew this before you shot them." "I knew enough." Alina met his eyes. "I knew they weren't going to stop. I knew they'd come back with more people, more weapons. And I knew that every day they operated, every hour they had to succeed, the danger increased." "So you made a judgment call." "I made the only call that mattered." Alina's voice softened slightly. "I'm not asking you to approve, Sheriff. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm just asking you to do your job, investigate, follow the evidence, and realize that sometimes the right thing looks ugly." Morrison stared at the documents, at the photos of men who would happily murder thousands for profit, at the reality of what Alina had prevented. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Alina smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. "Now the real work begins." The FBI arrived 36 hours later. 3 black SUVs, 8 agents, led by Special Agent Catherine Walsh, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a reputation for not suffering fools. Alina watched them approach from her porch. She'd expected this, prepared for it, but knowing something was coming didn't make it easier. Walsh climbed the steps alone. The other agents fanned out, securing the perimeter, examining the scene. Professional, thorough, exactly what Alina would have done. "Miss Blackwood," Walsh's voice was neutral. "I'm Special Agent Walsh, FBI. I need to ask you some questions about the events of October 8th. "Of course," Alina gestured to the chairs on her porch. "Would you like coffee?" Walsh paused. Most people in Alina's situation would be nervous, defensive. This calm hospitality was unexpected. "Sure." Alina poured 2 cups, black for both of them. Then she sat down and waited. "You killed 5 men," Walsh began. "I defended my property from armed intruders. At distances ranging from 800 to 1,100 yards, with 5 shots, 5 kills, no misses. I'm a trained sniper. When I shoot, I hit what I'm aiming at." Walsh leaned forward. Most people in a self-defense situation are terrified, shaking. They empty entire magazines and miss every shot. You made 5 perfect kills at distances that most people can't even see clearly. Most people aren't Navy SEALs with 47 combat missions. "No," Walsh agreed. "They're not, which raises a question. Was this self-defense or was this an execution?" Alina had known this was coming. The implication, the suspicion, that she'd murdered 5 men in cold blood and was hiding behind self-defense laws. "Do you know what a precision rifle is designed for, Agent Walsh?" Walsh blinked at the question. "What?" A precision rifle. What it's designed for. Alina didn't wait for an answer. It's designed to eliminate threats at range before they can harm you or others. It's a defensive weapon used offensively. That's what I did. I identified armed intruders who refused to leave, who advanced on my home, and I eliminated the threat before they could harm me. You could have fired warning shots. I did. I shot their generator, told them to leave. They refused. You could have called Sheriff Morrison and waited hours for help while armed men surrounded my home, while they dug up nuclear materials. Alina shook her head. No, I handled it myself. Walsh pulled out a tablet, showed Alina photos. Do you recognize these men? Alina studied the photos. 5 faces, the 5 men she'd killed, but also dossiers, criminal records, international connections. Viktor Kozlov, Russian national, arms dealer, suspected of facilitating nuclear material sales to terrorist organizations. Walsh swiped to the next photo. Marcus Tang, former Chinese military, dishonorable discharge, known associate of black market operators. Another swipe. 3 more just like them. These weren't random criminals, Miss Blackwood. These were professionals. I know. Walsh looked up sharply. You knew how. Alina gestured to her cabin. Come inside, I'll show you. What Alina showed Agent Walsh over the next 3 hours changed everything. The documents she'd compiled, the intelligence she'd gathered, the connections she'd made between Site Yankee 7 and an international network of nuclear materials traffickers. Walsh called in specialists, brought in more agents. Within 6 hours, Alina's cabin had become an operational command center for what would become one of the FBI's largest counterterrorism investigations in a decade. How did you find all this? Walsh asked, staring at Alina's research. This is better intelligence than we had. I know how.